London was silent that night, the kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat. Inside a locked room, a woman sat alone, eyes wide, breath unsteady. She exhaled one slow, trembling sigh, and in that same second, the window beside her cracked straight down the middle. No stone, no bullet, no intruder. Just a sigh, powerful enough to shatter glass. By morning, the woman was dead. And when Sherlock Holmes arrived, he didn't ask who broke the window. He asked why that single breath mattered more than the body on the floor. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the emotion someone tries hardest to hide. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Comment your city below. And if these impossible mysteries keep you hooked, like this video and subscribe, because each week on this channel, another silent clue is waiting to be solved. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and breathe slow. This is Sherlock Holmes and the sigh that cracked the window. We remained in the drawing room for some time, the heavy silence pressing upon us like a thick drape. Outside, the fog had crept closer, clinging to the window frame and seeming to swallow even the noise of passing carts. I could not tear my eyes from Mr. Edwin Maberly's still form, not for fear, but for curiosity. There was no blood, no wound, no telltale trace of violence. And yet, he was very much dead. Holmes, ever absorbed in his own methods, moved like a predator through the room, not in haste, but with uncanny certainty, touching a surface here, lifting a curtain there, peering closely at the grain of the floorboards near the chair where Maberly had met his mysterious end. There's no sign she left by the door. I asked Gregson, who stood with arms crossed at the threshold. None, he replied, jaw tight. She would have had to pass through the kitchen to exit. Mrs. Bloom was there the entire time. Perhaps she exited through the broken window, I offered, though it sounded absurd even to my own ears. Gregson shook his head. A drop of 12 feet to the garden. Grass below is soaked through, not a footprint to be found. Holmes finally spoke. No broken heel, no scrape on the sill, no fabric torn by glass. If she left through the window, she left without disturbing so much as a blade of grass or a breath of air. He turned to me. Watson, your medical opinion. Would you say the man died of fright? I hesitated. His expression is strange, as though he saw something unexpected. But fright alone, rare, Holmes. Even a weak heart shows signs of collapse. And Maberly doesn't appear particularly frail. Quite so, Holmes muttered. Then we must entertain a more curious hypothesis, that something was taken from him, something invisible, untraceable, not by weapon or by poison, but by presence alone. Gregson gave a snort. You speak in riddles, Holmes. I assure you, Inspector, the riddle is not mine. It belongs to whoever orchestrated this moment with such precision that even silence was part of the performance. He stooped again by the fireplace and extracted the sliver of ivory he had discovered. Earlier, you see this, he said, holding it aloft. A pawn, broken at the base, likely from that chess set. I glanced toward the mantel where the game sat undisturbed, or so it seemed. Holmes approached it with care, eyeing the board's arrangement. There, he said, white knight advanced recently, not dusted. And look, the black bishop's missing. He reached into the hearth once more and returned with a charred shape, half blackened but unmistakable. A bishop piece, burned nearly to ash. What could that mean? I asked, puzzled. Holmes replaced both fragments gently upon the mantel. It means the game was interrupted, or finished, in a manner not according to the rules. Before I could press him further, the front bell rang once more. Gregson raised his brows, expecting company. The constable reappeared a moment later with a calling card. Holmes took it and read aloud, "Miss Abigail Maberly." Concerning my uncle, Edwin Maberly. He raised an eyebrow. "Our visitor has arrived." Miss Abigail Maberly entered the room with restrained composure. She was a tall woman of perhaps 26 or 27, with refined features and deep-set gray eyes that carried the reserve of someone long accustomed to disappointment. She wore a modest navy cloak, her gloves unbuttoned, her expression poised but unmistakably shaken. "I came as soon as I received word," she said. I hardly know what to think. They said it was sudden." "It was," Holmes replied gently. "Please, Miss Maberly, sit. We must ask a few questions." She took the offered chair near the hearth, folding her hands in her lap. "Was it an illness? I saw him only a fortnight ago, and he seemed in strong health." "We are not certain of the cause," I said, glancing at Holmes, who remained by the shattered window. "I know what you're thinking," she said suddenly, "that someone wished him harm." Holmes studied her face. "Should we be thinking that, Miss Maberly?" She hesitated, then nodded faintly. "My uncle was not well liked. Not in recent years." "He had changed. In what way?" I asked. "He was paranoid," she said, "convinced someone was watching him. He had recently dismissed his solicitor and withdrawn most of his savings. He kept strange hours, refused visitors. There was talk of selling the house, yet he refused to move." Holmes interjected softly. "Do you know of a young woman, blonde, elegantly dressed, who might have visited him this morning?" Abigail's brows drew together. "No, unless," she paused. "He did receive letters from someone. A woman, I think. I saw the handwriting once, fine, slanted script. He never spoke of her, but he burned each letter in the fireplace. Every one." Holmes' gaze drifted to the hearth once more. "Was your uncle in the habit of playing chess?" She gave a short laugh. "Oh yes, obsessively, but only against himself. Never against visitors." "No," he said. "People made foolish moves." Holmes turned again to the window, where the jagged glass still glinted faintly in the gray light. He raised his hand, tracing a path through the empty space. "A sigh," he whispered again, as though the word itself were a riddle. After a long pause, he turned back to Gregson. "Inspector, I suggest the body be removed, but the room otherwise left untouched. I shall return tonight. There are some things best examined in darkness." Gregson scowled. "You think something will reveal itself then?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that whatever visited Mr. Maberly this morning has not entirely left." With that, he motioned to me, and we stepped out into the mist-laced street. The fog pressed close now, thickening as the light began to wane. "You saw it, Watson?" he asked as we walked. "Saw what?" He smiled faintly. "That Miss Abigail Maberly was lying." I turned to him, startled. "But about what?" Holmes gave no reply, only a thin, almost imperceptible smile as we vanished into the fog. Chapter 3: The Scent of Camphor and a Smashed Timepiece. The fog had thickened to a near liquid density by the time we reached Baker Street. and even the familiar outline of our windows above Mrs. Hudson's lodgings seemed to flicker like a phantom as we approached. Holmes was silent during the entire cab ride back from St. John's Wood, his gaze fixed upon a single point on the misted pane, as though waiting for a reflection to answer a question only he could hear. We had scarcely settled inside when he lit his pipe and stood at the window, one arm folded behind his back. She lied. "Watson," he said abruptly, "I know you said so earlier, but I confess I saw no sign of it." "She lied," Holmes repeated, in the way only those raised among liars can manage, without so much as a stammer or blink. He turned to me then, and in that dim light I could see the sharpness returning to his eyes, that glint that told me he had begun to find the threads of the tapestry. "She claimed she last saw her uncle a fortnight ago," he said. Yet there was an impression in the carpet, faint but still visible, of a parasol tip beside the fireside chair, and the faintest trace of camphor clung to the upholstery there, which had not been disturbed by the housekeeper. I asked. "Camphor?" Holmes nodded. "A common remedy for nerves, especially in ladies." But more curiously, the scent was recent, within 2 days. So either Miss Maberly was not honest about the last time she saw her uncle, or someone else quite like her visited very recently. I frowned. Could it not be the mysterious blonde visitor? Holmes merely smiled, a point worth considering. Indeed, we passed the rest of the day in quiet reflection. Holmes ventured out once to the British Museum for reasons he did not disclose, and returned with a small volume wrapped in brown paper. He did not open it, but placed it beside the fireplace with the same care one might give to a loaded pistol as evening fell. We returned to Wellington Place. The house was silent now, emptied of constables and servants. Gregson had left the place secured, with only the parlor untouched, per Holmes's instructions. A single oil lamp burned low near the stairwell, throwing shadows like fingers across the paneled walls. Holmes led the way up, moving with the hush of a man entering a sanctuary. I followed closely behind, my revolver tucked discreetly in my coat pocket, though I scarcely knew why. The drawing-room was precisely as we had left it. The chair still stood at the center, now vacant, the fireplace, cold and mute, and beyond it, the window, still shattered, the void in its frame breathing softly with the night air. Holmes did not speak. He moved immediately to the mantel and examined the chessboard again. The burned bishop had been left precisely as before. He lifted it once more and sniffed the charred wood. "Rosewood," he murmured, "cheap varnish, but a curious mark beneath the base." He handed it to me. Upon the bottom, nearly invisible, was a tiny engraved letter R, marking the piece as part of a set. I ventured. "Or something more personal," Holmes replied. "We shall see." He turned to the writing desk near the rear wall and opened its lid. A solicitor's desk, of course. But look, no ledgers, no financial records of any kind, only yellow. He drew out a thin sheaf of envelopes, tied with red twine. His fingers moved quickly, examining the wax seals, all broken, and the handwriting. One envelope, though empty, bore a scent, still faint, floral, something too expensive for everyday wear. "Same hand as the one who sent the burned letters, I'll wager," he said. "She must have delivered one in person, or more likely, read it to him aloud, then burned it herself." He returned the bundle with care and turned back to the room. Now we wait. We stood there for some time in silence. The minutes ticked past with the insistence of dripping water. I felt the peculiar weight of the room settle over me once again, the lingering chill, the taste of ash in the air. Then Holmes moved abruptly to the hearth. Kneeling, he shifted aside a few logs and retrieved something small and metallic, cracked down the center. I took it from him. The glass was indeed shattered, the hands frozen at 9:13. I pried it open and examined the interior. It stopped, I said. Holmes nodded. Which is odd, Watson, considering it was a modern piece. Self-winding, of good make. These don't simply stop without cause. He pointed to the hinge. See the dent. It was slammed shut with force. I glanced at the shattered window. Thrown, perhaps. Unlikely. No scratches on the outer case. It wasn't flung, it was crushed. I opened my mouth to ask how, but at that moment a sound stopped me. A creak, faint but clear, came from the hallway. Holmes turned, his body stiff. Then another sound, not a step, but a sigh. Soft, trailing, like breath escaping a closed chamber. It lasted less than a second. We waited. Holmes motioned me to remain still and approached the door. He opened it quietly and peered into the hall. Nothing, only the echo of silence. He returned to the mantel and retrieved the bishop piece once more. This time, he placed it squarely in the center of the chessboard. Let us see, he whispered. If she responds to a provocation. Before I could ask who she might be, a gust of wind curled into the room, no stronger than a whisper. And yet it stirred the curtains and rattled the frame of the empty window. The oil lamp flickered wildly. Holmes watched it with the sharp gaze of a falcon. Then, with sudden purpose, he stepped to the window and held his hand just outside the jagged edge. Warm, he said. Unnatural. I blinked. Warm at this hour. He withdrew his hand. The wind does not blow from the street, Watson. It rises from the garden. The chess piece on the board began to tilt. We watched. Breath caught. Then it fell, toppling to one side with a faint click. Holmes turned to me with a look I had seen only twice before, once in the Baskerville case, and once in a silent abbey in France, where a man had claimed to be dead for 2 days. She is answering, Holmes said, and I fear we are playing her game. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Shadows. There are few moments in my long association with Sherlock Holmes which I remember with such vivid unease as that evening in Edwin Baberley's drawing room. The chess piece, the bishop, blackened and once thought lifeless, had not fallen by accident. I am a man of medicine and logic, yet even I felt a tingling on my skin, as though the room itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. Holmes remained perfectly still after the piece toppled. His eyes, that strange blend of detachment and fire, fixed on the board. For several moments, no one spoke. Then, quite casually, he righted the bishop again. Now we wait, he said, softly, and returned to the hearth, as though the event had been no more than a candle flickering in a draught. I confess, I said, I find it difficult to dismiss what we've seen as mere coincidence. Good, he replied. Then your instincts remain intact, and yet you're calm. Not calm, Watson, focused. The distinction is essential. He began to pace the room slowly, fingers joined at the chin. Let us gather the facts. We have a dead man, no visible cause of death, A shattered window blown outward. A visitor who came and left without passage, without trace. A lingering warmth at the sill. And now, a chess piece, presumed inert, that responds to provocation. I hesitated. You believe we are dealing with something unnatural? He paused. No, but I believe the crime has been dressed in the garments of the unnatural, as a magician cloaks his trick in darkness, so the audience sees only what he allows. Holmes gestured toward the bishop. There are wires that can move chess pieces. That much is trivial. But no wire would explain the scent in the upholstery, the warped pocket watch, the sigh that preceded death. No single device, no simple trick, which tells me the method is layered and that the motive must match its complexity. At that moment, a knock came at the front door. 3 short raps, sharp and certain. Holmes froze, then smiled. She arrives, Watson. I stood, puzzled. Who? He stepped quickly to the staircase. Come, we shall meet our first suspect. We descended to the front hall, where a constable was already greeting a woman at the threshold. She was cloaked in deep plum velvet, her hair pinned with sharp precision, and though her features were striking, there was something in the set of her jaw that hinted at calculation. Miss Lydia Broom, she said, offering her hand. I believe you are expecting me. Holmes gave a small bow. Indeed, Miss Broom. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. You are the former ward of Mr. Maberly, are you not? Until my 25th birthday, she said. After that, I was simply the woman who refused his money. Yet you've returned. Her expression cooled. The housekeeper sent word. I did not think much of it until I heard of his death through other channels. You mean through the Maberly niece? Holmes asked. Lydia Broom raised one eyebrow. Abigail. No, I haven't spoken to her in over a year. We led her into the drawing room. She glanced at the broken window, but said nothing, taking in the scene with quick, sweeping eyes. I see the house is as he left it, she murmured. Holmes remained by the fire. You knew the man well, well enough to leave, and yet you returned. She exhaled slowly. Because I knew this would happen. I told him more than once. Someone would catch up to him. Holmes cocked his head. Catch up to him? Lydia turned, her face hardening. My guardian had enemies, Mr. Holmes, real ones. He represented dangerous clients, and he collected more than legal fees, secrets, papers, confessions. He kept them here. I think not in a safe, but in something no one would suspect, like a chessboard. She blinked. Exactly. Holmes' smile was razor-thin. Tell me, Miss Broom, did you ever see him receive letters from a woman? Her composure flickered. Yes, she said slowly. Always the same wax seal. But he would never speak of her. Only that she was dangerous. Not to him, but to herself. Did you ever meet her? No, but I heard her voice once. From the hall. Holmes leaned forward. What did it sound like? Not quite real, she whispered. Too soft, like breath through silk. Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes nodded slowly. You've been most helpful, but I must ask, were you here, Miss Broom, the day before Maberly's death? She hesitated. Yes, briefly. Why conceal it earlier? I had no desire to be tied to his final hours. But I did not harm him. I swear it. And did you see the chessboard then? Her brow furrowed. Yes, it was mid-game. He always played black against white, both sides, himself. Holmes turned away, thoughtful. Miss Broom gathered her cloak. If there's nothing else. One thing, Holmes said, without turning. When you left yesterday, did you see anyone watching the house? She paused at the door. Yes, a man. Across the street. He wore gray gloves and a bowler hat, though I never saw his face. When she had gone, Holmes closed the door gently behind her and turned to me. Well, Watson, she's holding something back, I said. Something she doesn't dare admit. But I believe she's frightened, not deceitful. Holmes smiled. An astute observation. The man in gray, if he exists, may be the key to the riddle. But for now, he returned to the drawing room and, to my surprise, knelt by the fireplace once more. From behind the coal grate, he extracted a folded scrap of linen, scorched but intact. Embedded in its weave were letters, blackened but legible. Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the queen. Holmes handed it to me without comment. What does it mean? I asked. He tapped the chessboard, where the bishop had once again fallen of its own accord. It means, he said, we are no longer the only players in this game. Chapter 5. A pawn. In the parlor by the next morning. The mood in Baker Street was unusually solemn. The fire had long since died, and yet Holmes had not moved from the armchair. He sat unmoving, the scorched linen message folded precisely in his fingers. The words still echoed in my mind. Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the queen. I cleared my throat as I poured coffee from the sideboard. Chess metaphors, cryptic instructions, a shattered window, and a visitor who doesn't leave footprints. We're bordering on the fantastic. And yet, Holmes murmured, without shifting, every fantasy has a spine of logic, Watson. The trick is finding it. You believe the message was meant for Maberly? Perhaps, or perhaps not. It could be a warning, or an invitation. And what concerns me most is the final phrase: she watches the queen. I frowned. A woman. The same mysterious visitor. Possibly. Or it may be that queen refers not to a person, but a role. Think, Watson. What do we know of our suspects? Abigail Maberly, the niece. Calm, composed, too composed. Lydia Broom, the former ward, conflicted, certainly afraid, and both with histories tied to the deceased. Holmes nodded. One conceals her presence. The other confesses but omits. And both, I suspect, are part of something larger. I watched him rise and step to the window, where the London morning had barely begun to bleach the fog from the street. A milkman passed, and somewhere nearby a dog barked twice, then fell silent. Where are we going? I asked, recognizing that particular gleam of movement in his frame. To the pawn, he said simply. Pawn. Holmes retrieved his hat and coat, and from a drawer took a slip of paper marked with a name and address. Mr. Caleb Voss, Voss and Perret. Curios and Antiquities, Barrack Street, Soho. Mr. Edwin Maberly, Holmes explained as we descended the stairs. Sold a number of items discreetly over the past 6 months. Not to auction houses, mind you, but to specialty dealers, including a certain Mr. Voss. Among the objects was an antique chess set carved from bone and ivory. A unique set created in Alsace around 1835, each piece engraved. Holmes nodded. Subtle marks beneath the base, initials, symbols, we found are on the bishop. I believe Maberly was attempting to unravel something, or perhaps to finish something left long undone. When we arrived at Voss and Perret, I was surprised to find the storefront unassuming, a narrow entrance tucked between a tobacconist and a bookseller. Its windows were filled with the usual curiosities: rusted compasses, fractured porcelain, brass doorknobs polished to a lonely gleam inside. The air was thick with beeswax and aged wood. Mr. Caleb Voss, a gaunt man in a brown waistcoat, regarded us through pince-nez spectacles with no evident surprise. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. Word travels quickly among collectors when a client expires under unusual circumstances. Holmes gave a courteous nod. "Then you know of Mr. Maberly's passing?" "I do. And I imagine you're here about the board." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You still have it?" Voss gestured to the back room. "Not the full set, but one piece, yes. He sold them individually, claimed they held personal memories he wanted to release." Holmes and I followed Voss into the narrow space beyond the counter. There, beneath a glass cloche, lay a single chess piece, a pawn. It was carved from ivory, its base marked with an ornate letter A, and a faint spiral etched along its crown. Holmes bent low. "He chose to sell the weakest piece last." "Not the weakest," Voss corrected. "The most faithful." Holmes looked up sharply. "Explain." Voss adjusted his spectacles. "In some cultures, particularly in Eastern Europe, the pawn was believed to represent the soul of the player, the first to fall, the last to ascend. There's an old legend that if all pawns cross the board, one may become something greater. A queen, yes, but only if she is worthy." I felt a chill brush my neck. Holmes straightened. "Did Maberly say anything when he brought this piece in?" Voss hesitated. "He asked if I believed in transformation. Then he wept." "Wept," I echoed. "Yes, it was brief, but unmistakable. He said he'd waited too long, that the bishop had fallen, and the queen no longer knew the board." Holmes nodded once, then gestured for Voss to lift the cloche. The piece was transferred gently to Holmes' gloved hand. "We'll take it," he said. "Consider it evidence." As we left the shop, Holmes remained silent for several paces. Then he turned to me and said, "The spiral on the pawn, do you recall where we've seen it?" I shook my head. "On the underside of the scorched linen," he said. "It was faint, but present, etched beneath the words, like a Maker S mark or a cipher." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes set the pawn on our mantelpiece beside the scorched bishop. He studied them like a priest reading runes. "3 pieces now accounted for," he murmured. "The bishop, the pawn, and the absent queen. But the game remains unfinished. And who plays opposite us?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he opened the brown-wrapped volume he'd retrieved from the British Museum the day before. It was a slim, rare monograph titled "The Codex of Laszlo Viv's Rituals in Symbolic Play." As he turned the pages, his expression grew grim. I leaned closer and read aloud, "When the board becomes the map, and the pieces hold memory, the one who watches chooses not by power, but by presence. The queen, once seen, may be lost forever." We sat in silence. Then Holmes closed the book with a soft thud. "Prepare yourself, Watson," he said. "Tonight we go back to the house." "To do what?" He met my gaze. "To find the queen." Chapter 6. The woman in the east window night had fallen in earnest by the time we returned to Wellington Place. The moon, thin as a whisper, hung low in the clouds, casting a pale sheen on the rooftops. Holmes walked ahead of me with measured pace, the wrapped pawn in his pocket, the codex of Laszlo Vivs under one arm. The house loomed darker than I remembered, not merely by lack of light, but by something deeper, a hush that pressed upon the senses as we reached the iron gate. Holmes paused and looked up at the second-floor window, where the glass had shattered outward days before. "She may be waiting," he murmured, "or watching." I said nothing. Some part of me still resisted the air of dread that clung to this case like dust to cobwebs. Yet with each step inside, I felt it grow heavier. The drawing-room had been left undisturbed per Holmes' instructions. The shattered window remained unrepaired, the furniture untouched. The bishop and pawn sat in their appointed places, as though waiting for the next move. Holmes lit 2 lanterns, but kept their wicks low, bathing the room in a soft amber glow. "We must reduce distraction," he said. "Light attracts the eye. Darkness invites the truth." He laid the codex open upon the chessboard, anchoring its corners with glass paperweights. His eyes scanned the text, fingers brushing the pages with unusual delicacy. "I believe," he said after several minutes, "that Mabberley was not merely playing chess. He was summoning memory and not just his own memory." I asked, puzzled. Holmes looked up. "The Codex speaks of psychotaxic implements, physical objects imbued with symbolic weight, items which, when arranged with intent and ritual, may act as conduits to submerged truths. The game was a map. The pieces were keys, and the queen, she is the enigma at the center. In many traditions, the queen is not merely a piece. She is the force that remembers, that haunts. If Mabberley misplayed her, he may have invoked something he could not banish. The silence between us was broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards underfoot. Turned his gaze toward the far end of the room, the east-facing window, smaller than the one shattered days ago. Its curtain was half-drawn, allowing a narrow line of moonlight to fall across the parlor rug. "We've spoken of the drawing-room," Holmes said softly, "but not of what lies beyond it." He moved to a door tucked behind a standing mirror. I had assumed it led to a closet or servant's passage, but when Holmes opened it, a narrow stairwell was revealed, steep and lined with faded wallpaper. "This led to his private study," Holmes explained. "Unmarked on the floor plan, Mrs. Bloom claims he sealed it off years ago." "And yet," I asked, "I found a handkerchief there last night, recently laundered camphor." Without waiting for reply, Holmes ascended. I followed. The staircase ended at a half-door, which Holmes opened with care. Inside was a small chamber, barely larger than a cupboard, with a writing desk and a single chair beneath the east window. The walls were lined with shelves, all bare save one, which held a single object. It was a photograph, an old daguerreotype, cracked at the edges. A woman sat in profile, her face obscured by the angle, her hand resting on the head of a carved chess queen. The ivory crown was unmistakable. Holmes turned the frame over. Written in faded ink, "Aurelia, Budapest, 1867. She was real," Holmes whispered, "and older than we guessed." I leaned forward. Could this be the mysterious visitor? The woman Abigail and Lydia hinted at not just a visitor, Holmes replied. A memory kept alive. Mabberley preserved this room. He returned to it often, see the wear on the floorboard before the desk, but he never changed the image. That tells me something. What? That she never aged. Not in his memory. Holmes opened the desk drawers. Inside were pages of journal entries, dense, slanted handwriting, lines crossed, rewritten, repeated. Most entries ended the same way: the Queen cannot forgive. At that moment, a low sound rose from the house below. Not a creak, nor the settling of old timbers, but something more delicate. A breath, a sigh. Holmes turned to me, his voice barely audible. She is near. We descended quickly, the sound having drawn us back to the drawing room. The lanterns remained dim, the pieces untouched, and yet the arrangement on the chessboard had changed. The bishop was gone. I looked around, heart pounding. Holmes. He pointed silently to the window. There, resting on the sill where glass once lay, was the bishop piece, its scorched body upright. As if deliberately placed, Holmes crossed to it and reached out, then stopped. There was a faint line, drawn in ash across the wood. A semicircle, a crescent moon. She's mocking us, he said. I looked to the east window and saw her. A figure, faint as mist, stood just beyond the glass. Not quite solid, not quite light. Her face was half turned, her hair bound in an old-fashioned style, her hand cradling something, a piece of ivory shaped like a queen. I blinked, and she was gone. Holmes exhaled. She's not a ghost, Watson. Then what? A memory sustained through ritual, anchored to this place by fear, guilt, and the unfinished game. We stood in silence as the wind shifted. Holmes turned slowly to me. 3 pieces remain: the knight, the rook, and the queen. He returned to the codex and turned the pages until he found the diagram he sought. At the center of every board, he said, is the place where choice is made. She is waiting for someone to make that move. Holmes, I asked, my voice low, are we playing the game now? He met my eyes. No, we've already played, and now it is her turn. Chapter 7. A game without players. The following day dawned gray and scentless, the London fog lying over the rooftops like a pall. Holmes had not slept. He had remained in the drawing room of Baker Street through the early hours, poring over the codex and cross-referencing its arcane diagrams with his own scrawled notes. He had spoken little, and when he did, it was mostly to himself, a low, murmuring stream of thought punctuated by phrases such as symbolic displacement and ritual closure dependent on memory, not intention. I brought him a pot of tea at 7:30. He did not look up, but gestured toward a page in the codex as I set it beside him. There's something here, Watson, he said. A reference to the unanchored queen. It implies that the queen, once removed from the board, cannot be replaced. Her role changes. She ceases to move like the others. She becomes the observer. I sank into the opposite chair, warming my hands on the porcelain. Then the figure we saw in the window, she is no longer a player. Holmes tapped the side of the teacup absently. Precisely. She was once. She moved, chose, loved, lost. But now she exists after the board, in the memory that keeps the game unfinished. And we are caught between the rules she remembers and the rules she has rewritten. It was nearly noon when a visitor arrived. Mrs. Hudson, flustered and unusually pale, led a tall, lean man into the sitting room. He wore a charcoal coat, impeccably pressed, and gray gloves that looked as though they had never known the damp. Inspector Lestrade sent me, the man said briskly, removing his hat. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. My name is Basil Harrow. I'm an archivist for the City of London Law Courts. My presence here, I believe it intersects your current inquiry." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Your name was not among the ones associated with Mr. Maberly's estate." "It wouldn't be," Harrow said. "I came across his name while combing through sealed documents, arbitration papers from 1867, long forgotten. Maberly was not a participant. He was a witness." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Witness to what?" Harrow drew a thin folder from his satchel. "A confidential inquiry into the sudden disappearance of a Hungarian woman, Aurelia Vives, the sister of a chess master who fled Budapest after a scandal involving falsified matches and a suicide." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "Vives," Holmes repeated. "Laszlo Vives, author of the Codex." Harrow nodded. "Indeed, Aurelia disappeared not long after the scandal. Rumors suggested she held secrets about the matches, about the nobleman's death, even that she played a role in falsifying the games. But what caught my attention, Mr. Holmes, is this." He produced a faded courtroom sketch. It depicted a young woman with elegant posture and distant eyes. One hand rested on her lap. The other unmistakably held an ivory queen. Holmes took the image gently. "And you believe Maberly knew her?" "He testified under seal," Harrow replied. "Claimed she came to him one night in London in the year 1870. Said she was being pursued. She begged him to hide the chess set, the real one, not a replica. She feared that if it remained together, it would continue the game of loss. Maberly agreed. So he scattered the pieces," Holmes murmured, "but could not let them go." Harrow nodded. The trial ended in silence. The documents were sealed. "But this image, this face, it matches a photograph in Maberly's personal study. I'm certain of it." "She is the queen," I said quietly. "Not metaphorically. She was the queen on the board." Holmes looked up at Harrow. "Do the documents say what happened to her?" "No, she vanished again. Some claimed suicide. Others claimed madness. But the board remained." Holmes stood abruptly. "Mr. Harrow, I thank you. You've brought clarity to a mystery wrapped in centuries of forgetting." Harrow hesitated. "Do you believe the game is still being played?" Holmes turned back to the fire. "No, I believe the game ended long ago, but the board doesn't know that yet." After the archivist left, Holmes turned to me. "We must return," he said, "to Maberly's study tonight." I nodded. "To do what?" "To end the game." That evening, we arrived once more at Wellington Place. The constables had long since withdrawn. The house sat vacant and mute. Holmes carried only a satchel and a lantern. He moved without hesitation up the stairs and into the sealed study. There he placed the three known pieces, bishop, pawn, queen, onto the desk in a precise triangle. Then, from his satchel, he retrieved two small items wrapped in cloth, the knight and the rook. "Where did you?" "I had them traced," he said. "The rook was sold to a chess club in Battersea, the knight to a collector in Knightsbridge. I retrieved both this afternoon." He paused, then added, "The king was never carved. The set was made deliberately incomplete. No king." Holmes shook his head. "Aurelia never believed the king should decide the game. Only those who lost something could claim the right to shape its end." He arranged the pieces carefully, consulting the codex one final time. Then he extinguished the lantern. In the hush of that narrow room, a strange thing occurred. The temperature dropped slightly. A faint hum, like the friction of memory against silence, filled the air. And then the pieces began to tilt. The rook tipped backward. The knight turned in place. The queen lifted, as if by unseen fingers, and fell gently to its side. Checkmate. The hum ceased, and somewhere in the house below, a sound so soft it might have been the settling of dust sighed through the hallway. We descended in silence. The drawing-room had changed. The air was warmer now. The shattered glass had ceased to moan in the wind. And in the place where the bishop had stood, nothing remained. Not even Holmes turned to me. "It is over," he said. "The board is empty." Chapter 8. The Hand That Moved the Queen. The next morning, I awoke to find Holmes already bathed, dressed, and at work by the hearth. A soft breeze pushed through the half-open window, disturbing the stack of telegrams on the writing table. Holmes stood with one hand resting on the mantel, his gaze distant, yet not unfocused. He had not touched breakfast. "Is it truly over?" I asked, setting down my cup. "The board, the pieces, Aurelia, do you believe we've brought it to a close?" Holmes remained silent for a moment before turning toward me. "The board, the memory, perhaps, but the hand that moved the queen, that remains unknown." "You mean someone still alive?" He nodded slowly. "Someone who knew the rules, someone who orchestrated the return of the pieces, who brought the codex back into play, who ensured Maberly's end appeared not only puzzling, but impossible." I felt the weight return to my chest. "Then this was no haunting." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, reaching for a thin black notebook. "It was a haunting of the highest order, but not by spirits, by people, by secrets." He tossed a photograph onto the table. The daguerreotype of Aurelia Vivswy had recovered from Maberly's study. She was clever, yes, symbolic, possibly even dangerous. But she died long ago. That much I now believe. Then who? Holmes held up a hand. "Consider Watson, who benefits from Maberly's death. Who was close enough to influence his last days, yet distant enough to appear innocent? Abigail." He shook his head. "Too cautious, too composed. A silent witness, perhaps, but not the hand that moved the queen. Lydia." He tapped the table twice, an affirmative gesture. "She lied about the last time she saw Maberly, lied about the letters, lied about the chessboard. But she told one truth. She heard the woman's voice once. That suggests proximity, familiarity, a shared language. But the image in the window was a reflection," Holmes said, "of what Maberly remembered, not what stood there that night." He paced slowly now, as he often did in the final phases of deduction. "Lydia Broom," he continued, "raised under Maberly's guardianship, deeply educated, suffered financial hardship but refused aid, carried a history of estrangement from Abigail. And most crucially, she knew of Aurelia. She said so. Her name, her fear. And she referred to the queen as if she remembered playing against her." I stood. "You believe Lydia was not merely a ward? What? A descendant?" Holmes stopped pacing. "No, I believe Lydia was Aurelia's student." The idea struck me with such force that I sat down again. "A student of what?" I asked. "Of memory," Holmes said. "Of ritual, of psychological construction." Aurelia was a master strategist, a woman who used symbols to reshape narrative. And I believe Lydia, under Maberly's care, learned how to complete the game Aurelia never could. But why kill him? Holmes moved to the mantel and lifted a small envelope. This arrived not an hour ago. No sender, no return address. He handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. At its center, a single sentence in fine script. He refused to sacrifice the queen. So I became her. I stared at the page. She claims to be the queen. She claims, Holmes said softly, to have taken on the role to finish what Aurelia began. The line between identity and symbol has blurred for her. She no longer plays the game. She is the board. I exhaled slowly. Holmes, what do we do with that? He retrieved his pipe and lit it with deliberate care. The smoke curled upward, drifting in lazy spirals across the ceiling. We speak to her that afternoon. We returned once more to Wellington Place. The house had been formally sealed, but Holmes produced a written order signed by Lestrade, permitting temporary access. We found the drawing room still empty, the board cleared, the window still gaping. But the oppressive sense of expectancy had faded. Holmes moved directly to a sideboard drawer and retrieved a small notebook. I had not noticed it before. Maberly's personal ledger, he said, his true one, hidden behind false receipts. He flipped it open, revealing columns of names and notations. Many were crossed through, but one line, faintly underlined, reads simply, L. Broom, Q. accepted, R. sacrificed. What does that mean? I asked. It means she agreed to take the queen's role, Holmes said, and that the rook, someone close, was removed in her stead. He turned to me. Do you recall the phrase on the linen? I nodded. Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the queen. Holmes traced the page with a finger. But what if the bishop was the rook, a confidant, and the queen, Aurelia, already gone? Then the game was not about death, I said slowly, but about legacy. Holmes snapped the ledger shut. Precisely. He crossed to the writing desk and took out a blank sheet of paper. In quick, careful script, he wrote a single line. You played brilliantly, but the board is no longer yours. He placed the page beneath the glass dome that once held the pawn. I suspect, he said. That will be answer enough. As we turned to leave, I glanced one final time toward the empty chessboard. The morning's light had begun to creep across the room, touching each square like a new beginning outside. The fog had lifted, and though neither of us said so, I think we both felt it. The game, at last, was truly finished. Chapter 9. The letter with no seal, the following morning, was brighter than any in recent memory. A rare sun cut through the usual London gloom, casting long, clean shadows across Baker Street. Yet even the clarity of day could not dispel the shadow that clung to Holmes' thoughts. He sat at the breakfast table, not touching the toast before him, reading and rereading the note he had left under the pawn's dome at Wellington Place. It was moved. Watson, he said without looking up. You mean the letter? Holmes nodded. I returned early this morning. The glass cloche had been lifted. The note was gone. No signs of forced entry. No damage, no disturbance. But the pawn remained exactly where I left it, standing alone on the board. Then she read it. She did more than read it, Holmes murmured. She accepted it. I leaned forward. Then Lydia Broom. Holmes sighed and set the empty cloche on the mantel beside the bishop and queen pieces. Lydia has not left London. I had her followed. She dined alone last night at a small cafe on Denby Street. She left no message, spoke to no one, and yet, I believe she said all she intends to say. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual caution and handed Holmes a plain, unmarked envelope. No address, no stamp, no seal. It was left at the door, she said, by a young boy, barely 12. Said a woman paid him 6pence to deliver it by hand. Holmes examined the envelope carefully. There was no writing at all, just a faint watermark, the outline of a chess rook. He opened it with a blade and removed a single folded page. His eyes flicked back and forth, scanning quickly, then again, slower. "Well?" I asked. He passed it to me without a word. "Mr. Holmes, you understand now, I think? I do not confess because I committed no crime, not in the sense the law can touch. What I did or did not do was the final move in a game Maberly began decades ago, a game that cost lives long before I arrived at the board. He wanted to protect her, Aurelia, but in doing so, he betrayed what she gave him. He let her memory rot in silence, chained by guilt. He thought by scattering the pieces, he could scatter the truth. But the truth clings, Mr. Holmes. It waits. I did not kill him. I simply reminded him of the moves he refused to see. I placed the pieces where they once belonged. I showed him the game could still be played, that it was being played. And when the queen was returned to the board, he understood. He sighed, and the window broke. I believe he saw her. Then he died, free. As for me, I will no longer play. The pieces are yours. Now let them rest. L.I. looked up, stunned. Holmes, she admits everything and yet nothing. Precisely, he said. And that is the brilliance of it. You said you don't believe she killed him. I don't, Holmes replied. The medical report, which arrived last evening, confirms it. No poison, no trauma, no foul play. Heart failure brought on by acute emotional shock. His body, Watson, simply gave out, and the window. Thermal shock, Holmes said. Rare, but not impossible. A sudden rise in temperature from the hearth combined with a cold draft from the hallway could have shattered the old glass outward, just as the housekeeper described. I set the letter down. So she frightened him to death. She guided him to remembrance, Holmes corrected. And that is not a crime. We sat in silence, the weight of it all finally settling between us. I struggle with the morality of it, I admitted. If she knew the truth, if she held the key to his unraveling, then isn't she still responsible? Holmes tapped the envelope with a single finger. Watson, morality and legality often sit on different chairs, sometimes even different sides of the room. Later that day, Holmes asked me to accompany him once more to Wellington Place. The house had already begun to shift in tone. Sunlight now reached the drawing room, illuminating the dust as it swirled lazily in the warmth. Holmes walked slowly to the chessboard. The pieces were gone, all of them. Not a trace remained, not the pawn, not the bishop, not the queen. Even the board itself had been cleared, wiped clean, polished to such a shine it seemed almost unused. Holmes did not speak. He simply walked to the hearth, where a faint curl of white ash had gathered in the corner. He reached down and lifted something from the soot, a sliver of ivory. I leaned in. It bore a single mark, the letter Q. "She's destroyed them," I said. Holmes studied the fragment for a long moment. "Or set them free." As we turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the east-facing window, the one above the sealed study. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure there, a woman in profile, her face turned slightly, her hand resting on a piece that no longer existed. But when I blinked, it was gone, back in Baker Street. Holmes placed the ivory fragment on the mantel beside the scorched bishop's base, a memory of a game no longer played. "There's something beautiful," he said softly, "in a puzzle that resists being solved." I nodded. "But also something tragic." Holmes poured himself a measure of brandy. "Not tragic, Watson, poetic." He raised the glass to the queen who watched, and to the sigh that cracked the window. I lifted mine, and we drank, not to victory, but to understanding. Chapter 10. The silence left behind, though the mystery of Edwin Maberly's death no longer loomed with the same ominous weight. Its residue lingered with us, like the faint scent of smoke in a room long since extinguished. Holmes, though composed as ever, had grown increasingly reflective in the days following the final letter's arrival. He spent hours gazing into the fire, or staring absently into the gray London streets, where the fog now seemed less like a veil and more like a curtain drawn between acts. I, too, felt unsettled. The pieces had vanished, the board had been cleared, and yet I could not shake the sensation that we had not reached the end of the tale, only the quiet that followed its middle. Holmes, ever the master of precision, did not indulge such feelings easily, but even he, that Thursday morning, betrayed something of the same unrest. "I received another parcel," he said as I entered the sitting-room, the fire already crackling and his pipe well lit. He handed me a plain brown envelope, thicker than the letter Lydia had sent, but similarly unmarked. Inside was a slim notebook, leather-bound, its pages filled with tight, elegant script. I asked. Holmes nodded. "A journal, found behind a false panel in the floor of his study. It was discovered by the bank's appraiser during the estate review. Odd, isn't it? A man who scattered the chess pieces kept the queen's game buried just beneath his feet." I opened the journal carefully. The pages smelled faintly of camphor and old ink. The first entries were dated 1871, 4 years after Aurelia Vivers's disappearance. I read aloud. "I dream of her again. Her voice is quieter now, less accusatory. She watches from the board's far end, but I no longer know if she waits for me to move, or forgives me for not having moved sooner." Another passage, dated 1874, struck me with more force. "The set is cursed, yes, but not by magic, by memory. Each piece holds a moment, a mistake, the queen most of all. I scattered them not to lose her, but to keep her from returning." Holmes leaned forward. "And yet he invited her back in the end. You saw how the pieces began to reappear in his home. He allowed it. He allowed her. But if he feared her memory, why?" Holmes tapped the journal. "Because time softens even guilt. Because love, twisted as it may become, never fades entirely." He sat back, then gestured for me to read one final entry, written only 2 months before Maberly's death. "A visitor came again today. She wore Aurelia's scent. She knew the bishop's name. She placed a single pawn on the board and said, We only need 3 more. I should have thrown her out. I offered tea, Lydia, I said quietly, undoubtedly. And he let her proceed. He let the game begin again, Holmes replied. Not because he was compelled, but because he was ready. He stood and crossed to the window, folding his arms as he looked out toward the street below. There are crimes that violate law, Watson, and crimes that violate the heart. Maberly's was the latter. He betrayed someone, whether Aurelia or Lydia or both, and he lived with the echo of that betrayal for 40 years. And Lydia, she gave him the only justice she could, the chance to finish the game on his own terms. I stared at the journal's final page. There was a single word, scrawled in haste, mate. We sat in silence for some time. Holmes, uncharacteristically, had no desire to pursue the matter further. No official report to Lestrade, no evening newspaper column, no summary. Penned in haste. The game, in his mind, was over. And he, like the pieces, had stepped away from the board. Yet for my part, I could not leave it so easily. That night, unable to sleep, I returned alone to Wellington Place. The house was dark, but not empty. Time had begun its slow, relentless work of erasure. Dust had settled over the banister rails. The air felt different, not ominous, merely indifferent. I walked the halls quietly, every board beneath my feet giving a low, familiar groan. In the drawing room, I lit a single lantern. The chessboard was still gone, but something had returned. On the mantel, nestled between 2 candlesticks, stood the ivory queen, not scorched, not broken, perfectly upright. I stared at it for some time, unsure whether I felt fear, wonder, or simply awe. Then I reached out, and just as my fingers touched the cool ivory, I heard it, the softest sound imaginable. Not a whisper, not a breath, but a sigh. And it came not from the room, but from somewhere inside me, as though something I did not know I carried had been released. I placed the queen gently in my coat pocket and left the house, back in Baker Street. Holmes greeted me with his usual calm. She returned it, didn't she? He said without turning. I placed the queen on the mantel. He nodded. The final gesture, not a challenge, a farewell. I thought the game was over. He smiled faintly. Even when the pieces rest, Watson, the board, remembers. And in the silence that followed, I understood what he meant. Some mysteries do not cry out to be solved. They wait, and sometimes they sigh. Chapter 11. A queen without a kingdom. The following week passed without incident. The fog returned, as it always did, softening the edges of London until even the chimneys seemed to drift like old ships. Holmes resumed his routine with quiet efficiency, reading newspapers with surgical interest, accepting minor consultations, and tending to his violin with meticulous care. But I could tell the Maberly case lingered with him, not as an unfinished thread, but as a faint indentation left upon the glass, long after the object has been removed. The ivory queen still stood on our mantel, untouched, unexamined. Holmes had made no move to return it to Scotland Yard, nor to add it to any archive. It remained exactly where I had placed it after retrieving it from Wellington Place. Sometimes I found myself watching it for minutes on end, uncertain whether I expected it to move or simply vanish again. It never did. "Have you noticed," I said one morning, "how it reflects the light differently than anything else on the shelf?" Holmes looked up from his notes. because it was never carved to reflect. Aurelia's set was designed to absorb, to drink memory, not cast it. You speak of it as though it's still alive. Holmes tilted his head. Not alive, Watson, but not inert either. That morning brought with it a letter, this one sealed, stamped, and formally addressed. It bore the crest of a solicitor's office in Mayfair. Holmes opened it without ceremony. After reading it once, he passed it to me, to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In accordance with the final testament of Miss Lydia Broom, dated 3 weeks ago and held in private trust, we are to inform you of her passing yesterday afternoon. She died peacefully in her sleep at a residence in Oxfordshire under a private name. She left no direct heirs. Her final instructions specified that you be informed personally and that the enclosed item be delivered into your care. With respect, Percival and Moon. Solicitors enclosed was a small red velvet pouch. Holmes untied the ribbon and poured its contents onto the table. A single chess piece, the knight, smooth, rounded, and as ivory pale as the queen. He studied it silently, then set it beside the queen on the mantel. You suspected she was ill? I asked gently. He nodded. She mentioned it only once, in her second letter, the one I never showed you. She said the game had to be completed before the final hour came for her, too. I thought it symbolic. I was wrong. You don't seem surprised. Holmes sat back. She orchestrated her ending with the same precision she applied to the board. She knew the game would outlive her only if it remained unfinished. But by returning the queen, she made peace, and with the knight, she left me the final move. I felt the weight of the room settle again. What move is there left to make? Holmes stood and paced before the hearth. The knight is the only piece that does not move in straight lines. It shifts in curves, diagonals. It finds the side doors, the paths others do not consider. I frowned. You think this is a message? He stopped pacing. I think Lydia was telling us where to look. That afternoon, we returned one final time to Wellington Place. The house had been formally entered into probate, and its contents but Holmes had arranged a short window of access. He moved with quiet deliberation, as though this final visit was more of a courtesy than an inquiry. We ascended to the study. Nothing had changed. The desk was empty, the bookshelves bare, the floor polished. Even the window looked freshly scrubbed, the pale winter light pouring through in elegant, harmless beams. Holmes knelt at the floorboard where Maberly's journal had been discovered, and then he tapped once, twice. The third knock produced a hollow sound. He pried up a loose board and retrieved a small iron box, no larger than a cigar case. The lock had rusted, but with a firm twist of his knife, Holmes opened it. Inside was a photograph, a second portrait of Aurelia Vivesnot in profile, but facing the lens directly. Her eyes were dark, intense, intelligent. In her lap sat the chessboard, and in her hand was the knight. Behind the photograph, folded neatly, was a note. For whomever returns the pieces, you may think this is a game of power, or memory, or grief. But it is none of these. It is a game of choice. We cannot alter the past. We can only choose what we carry forward. I chose to be remembered, not for who I was, but for what I left behind. If you understand this, you know what must be done. Destroy the board. Aurelia V. Holmes refolded the paper. then reached into his coat and withdrew a matchbook. Without hesitation, he lit one match, then another, and placed them in the hearth. He placed the iron box upon the flame. It took several minutes. The box hissed and darkened. The photograph caught quickly. The scent of smoke and old camphor filled the room. He made no dramatic gesture, no remark. Only when it was finished did he speak. "She was never the queen, Watson." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" "She was the board. The others were merely pieces." We left the house in silence. Back at Baker Street, Holmes returned the night to its pouch, then sealed it in an envelope marked "Private, Return to Archive." He kept the queen. I thought you said we must destroy the board. "I did," he replied, "but the queen was never part of it. And what is she now?" Holmes gazed at the piece on the mantel. "She is no longer a player," he said, "but neither is she a prisoner." I looked once more at the pale curve of the queen's crown. No light reflected, none needed. Some stories, I have come to understand, do not end with answers. They end with silence, and sometimes with release. Chapter 12. The final position. Winter had taken firm hold of London. The Thames moved slowly beneath a crust of half-formed ice, and the air in Baker Street had turned dry and sharp, causing every footstep on the stairs to sound more deliberate than usual. I had taken to keeping the fireplace lit from morning till night, but Holmes, curiously, had begun to spend more time staring into the cold hearth than stoking it. The queen still stood on our mantelpiece, silent, watchful, not a relic, not quite a memory, but something else, a presence of sorts that had not faded with time, but rather settled like dust in a room long sealed. On the third morning of December, I found Holmes at his desk with a fresh letter before him, already opened. His brow was furrowed in a way I had not seen since the days of our most confounding cases. "A response," he said, without looking up. "Of a kind, from whom?" He handed me the letter. It was written in a looping hand, slightly unsteady, as though the writer were unused to the act. "Mr. Holmes, I write not to reopen what has closed, but to acknowledge what was finished. The board has been destroyed. The echoes are fading, but some shadows, as you know, are cast not by light, but by absence. She told me to let it go, to let her go, and I did. But I am not like her. You returned the night to the archive. That was correct, but the queen must remain in your keeping, not as evidence, not as memory, as witness, a. I lowered the letter slowly. Holmes spoke quietly. Abigail Maberly, the niece. My thoughts reeled. She was part of it all along. She was, Holmes replied, the last unplayed piece. I sat beside the fire, unsure how to absorb the revelation. She knew, I said finally, about Aurelia, about Lydia, about the board. Holmes nodded. She knew, but she refused to take part. She watched. She waited. And when the final piece was placed, she ensured the queen found its way to us, not to preserve the past, but to close it. I stared into the flames. But why now? Why write it all? Holmes glanced toward the window, where frost had begun to lace the corners of the glass. Because endings require acknowledgement, even silent ones, especially those. We passed the afternoon in thoughtful silence. Holmes penned a short response. folded it into a plain envelope, and sent it off with no return address. By evening, the fog returned as if called. Holmes rose from his chair, approached the mantel, and carefully lifted the Queen from her place. "She has served her purpose," he said. "For whom?" I asked. "For all of them," he replied, "and perhaps for us." I followed him to the fireplace. He knelt, held the piece over the unlit grate, and then paused. "I once believed, Watson," he said, "that all things could be resolved through logic, that truth was always the final square on the board. And now, he said, "I know some truths cannot be known, only honored." He set the Queen gently in the grate. Then he stood, but he did not strike the match. We stood there a long while, the Queen resting between soot and ash, surrounded by the memory of 1,000 forgotten flames. Finally, Holmes turned away. "She need not burn," he said. "Not every piece must be removed to end the game." That night, I could not sleep. I found myself thinking of Aurelia and Maberly, of Lydia and Abigail, of voices that sighed and games that moved without hands. I thought of the pawn and the knight, of rooks fallen and bishops sacrificed. And I thought of the Queen not as a woman, not even as a symbol, but as a position on the board, the place one could never quite reach without consequence. In the stillness of early morning, I rose and returned to the hearth. The Queen was gone. No sound had been made, no doors opened, no ash stirred, just absence. And in that absence, peace. When Holmes entered the room later, he paused only briefly, glanced at the empty grate, and nodded once. "She chose it," he said. "I didn't need to ask who." The fog outside had lifted. The city, ever indifferent, had resumed its rhythm, and Holmes, with his usual quiet clarity, poured himself a cup of tea and opened the morning paper. Not a single headline mentioned Edwin Maberly, not one obituary named Aurelia. Vivs, spaces between pages and pawns, between shadows and sighs. It had been played to its end, and the board finally was still. Chapter 13. The Echo in the Wood Granite was several weeks after the Queen vanished from our hearth that the matter of the Maberly affair might have been considered finished. The weather remained bitter, with low sunrises and icy pavements, and Holmes had returned to the rhythm of lesser distractions, solving a case of a misplaced will in Kensington, and investigating a minor forgery at the Guildhall. These mundane affairs gave him little satisfaction, but they passed the time. I could see, though, that something remained unresolved behind his eyes. We spoke less of Lydia Broom, less of Aurelia Vivs, and we never mentioned Abigail's final letter again, yet it lingered in the space between sentences, as all true hauntings do. One morning Holmes sat unusually still, the daily paper untouched beside him. His fingers were laced together before his face, and his eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in deep calculation. I dared to interrupt. His eyes opened at once. "Not thought, Watson. Heard." He gestured toward the sideboard. "In the letter from the solicitor. Recall the phrase, 'She died peacefully in her sleep, at a residence in Oxfordshire, under a private name.'" I nodded. "Yes, I remember. But it's not the phrase that interests me. It's the place, Oxfordshire. A curious choice for someone so deeply entangled in London's memory." I leaned forward. "You think she went there for a reason?" "I do. Lydia Broom was not a woman who did things idly. She played chess with time, Watson, not opponents. Her decision to go there, just as the pieces were returning, suggests she wished to be near something or someone. Holmes retrieved a map and spread it across the table. With a pencil, he drew a circle around a rural village nestled along the Thames Valley, Dorchester-on-Thames, a quiet place. Fewer than 400 souls. But more importantly, home to the Viv's collection. My pulse quickened. Aurelia's belongings? He nodded. After her disappearance, her brother Laszlo left the country in disgrace. But her private effects journals, photographs, and select artifacts were donated by an anonymous benefactor to a local antiquarian society. They've remained in private archives ever since. And you think Lydia went to what? See them? Holmes folded the map. No, I think she went to leave something behind. We departed that same afternoon, traveling by train through a snow-slick countryside. The journey was slow but quiet, the sort of passage that feels suspended outside of time. As we drew nearer, I found myself gripped by a strange anticipation, not dread, not quite curiosity, a hush like the one that precedes revelation. Dorchester was everything Holmes had promised, ancient, understated, nearly untouched by the last 50 years. The Antiquarian Society occupied a former manse on the edge of the village, surrounded by bare trees and a low stone wall covered in ivy. We were met by a young curator, Mr. Linwood, who had already received Holmes' letter of inquiry. "You're here about the Viv's archive?" he asked, as we stepped into the candle-scented warmth of the reading room. "We haven't had anyone ask about that name in a very long time." "I'm not surprised," Holmes replied, "but I believe Miss Broom may have visited recently." Linwood nodded. "She came several times over the last year. Always reserved the same study room. Said she was researching a book on women's contributions to psychological symbolism. Never published anything, so far as I can tell. But she left a lasting impression." "In what way?" "She asked questions, not about facts, but about intentions. Wanted to know why Aurelia carved certain symbols into her pieces, what the knight meant to her, why the queen was always taller than the king." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "She left something here," Holmes said. "Didn't she?" Linwood hesitated, then gestured for us to follow. He led us down a quiet corridor, then into a narrow alcove where a low table stood beneath a leaded glass window. Upon the table was a single object, a small wooden box, polished and unadorned. "She left that," Linwood said, "on her final visit. No name, just a note inside, to be opened by one who understands the game. I didn't know what it meant, but then your letter arrived." Holmes lifted the lid carefully. Inside, resting on velvet, was a final chess piece, the king dot. It was unlike the others carved, not from ivory, but from dark rosewood, simple, unpolished, heavy in the hand beneath it. A card bore a single sentence in Lydia's unmistakable script: "The king never ruled. He only remembered." Holmes stood very still. Then he set the piece down with reverence. "She completed the set. Even though Aurelia never carved the king, she made it," Holmes replied. "Lydia gave the game its final piece, not to be played, but to be placed." He turned to me. "Do you see it now, Watson? It was never about winning, never about sacrifice or strategy. It was about acknowledgement. The queen may have haunted the board, but the king was the board's conscience. He could not move far, could not claim power, but he saw every wound, every silence. We said little else that day. The peace remained behind, as per Lydia's final wish. Not in a museum case, not labeled or displayed. It sat in a quiet corner, beside a window that looked east, toward memory, toward the board. That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes lit the fire at last, as the flames crackled to life. He held out his hand to me, palm open. The Queen had returned, not in ivory, not in smoke, but in meaning. She is no longer ours to carry, he said, but she is never far. And I, who had once feared this tale would end in shadows, saw that it had not ended at all. It had settled, and in settling, become part of us, part of him. And though no new letters arrived, and no more pieces stirred upon the board, I knew as surely as I knew my own name, that in some deep place of mind and memory, the game would always remain. Chapter 14. The Archive of Forgotten Games. It was not in Holmes' nature to ruminate over cases once they had reached their conclusion, at least not aloud. And yet I noticed that since our return from Dorchester-on-Thames, he had grown quieter, more introspective. He played his violin in slower, more mournful keys. He walked less and spoke only when necessary. Not from melancholy, I believed, but from reflections, some vast internal ledger now being balanced. Silently within him, he had not spoken of the Rosewood King again, nor had we mentioned Lydia's note. But one night, as the snow ticked faintly against the windows, and the city outside lay under the hush of winter, he turned to me unprompted. "You remember, Watson," he said, "when I told you there was something beautiful in a puzzle that resists being solved?" "I do," I replied. "You said it during the Maberly affair." He nodded, and I believed it then. But I think now I was mistaken. It is not the unsolved puzzle that is beautiful, but the one that continues to shape you long after it is solved. I folded the newspaper in my lap. "You think the case shaped you?" "I think," he said slowly, "it revealed something I had overlooked, that not all truths belong in the open. Some must be buried, merely placed gently aside." We sat a moment in silence. Then, quite abruptly, Holmes rose and crossed to the bookshelf. He drew from the lower shelf a modest black ledger, a volume I had seen often but never opened. It bore no title on its spine, only the faint imprint of a chessboard carved into the leather. He placed it on the table and opened it halfway through. "Years ago," he said, "I began keeping an account of cases I never published, matters too delicate for the papers, too intimate, too symbolic. This," he tapped the open page, "was the first." I leaned forward. The heading read, "The Archive of Forgotten Games." Below it, penned in Holmes' elegant hand, was a list. Not names, not dates, just simple entries. The seamstress who dreamt of fire, the orchard that bloomed in December, the drowned man's whisper, the watchmaker's silence, the sigh that cracked the window. I sat back, stunned. "You've kept them all." "Every one that played like a game, but ended like a story," he said. "This last one, it belongs among them." He removed a folded paper from the back of the ledger. It was the final note from Lydia Broom. Without a word, he slid it into a sleeve, bound into the inside cover. He then reached into the drawer beside him and withdrew the only remaining token from the case, the scorched bishop fragment we had found in Maberly's hearth. He placed it atop the ledger. "I won't keep the Queen," he said. "Not here. Where will she go? Holmes looked toward the fire, where she always was. In the move that was never made, he closed the book with quiet finality. The next morning, Holmes departed for the British Library, where he arranged to have the Rosewood King quietly added to the Viv's archive under an anonymous donation. The archive of forgotten games he returned to the shelf without comment. But the Bishop fragment he gave to me, to remind you, he said, that some pieces fall not in error, but in purpose. For a time we resumed our lives. Clients came and went. Cases emerged, were solved, and faded into the great rhythm of London. The world, it seemed, had little interest in queens or knights once they stopped moving, and yet something had changed. It was small, almost imperceptible, but one evening, as Holmes reviewed correspondence and I penned notes by the lamplight, he asked me, "Do you believe memory can haunt a place without occupying it?" I thought for a moment. "I believe memory is the haunting." He nodded. "Then we are haunted only by what we refuse to place. As on a board, Watson, as in a game. Give a memory its square, and it cannot move beyond it." "And the Queen?" I asked. He did not answer, but later that night, I found that the mantelpiece once the Queen's resting place was bare in its stead. Holmes had placed something unexpected. A blank square of wood, no larger than a tile, no inscription, no mark, just space. I did not ask him about it. I did not need to. It was the final piece, not the Queen, not the King, not any player at all, but the space between them, where choices had been made, and where they could no longer be unmade. Weeks later, we received one final letter, no name, no return address, just a small card, written in a familiar hand. "The board is yours now. Play gently, A." Holmes smiled faintly when he read it. "It was never our board, Watson, only our turn." He placed the card in the black ledger between pages, and with that, the story we never fully told, the game we never meant to play found its final position. The board, now still, the players, at peace and memory. Memory, at last, allowed to rest. Chapter 15. The Game Beneath the Game. The Final Weeks of Winter. Holmes returned to his habits with the practiced ease of a man re-entering a familiar role. He resumed reading 6 newspapers each morning, analyzed the constancy of pipe tobacco among city bankers, and found himself briefly absorbed in a mystery involving the fraudulent delivery of German surgical tools to a Fleet Street apothecary. It was all very normal, very manageable, and yet, as I observed him one February evening, I could tell he was performing, not living. The Bishop's fragment still rested atop the black ledger, the square of wood-blank, smooth and undecorated, remained at the center of our mantel. Nothing else in the room had changed, and that, in its own way, was unsettling. Holmes noticed me watching. "Go on," he said, without looking up. "You've been holding the question behind your teeth for 3 days." I smiled wryly. "Do you believe there was another layer to it? One we missed?" He did not answer right away. Then he rose and poured 2 small brandies, handing one to me. "There was always another layer," he said. "That's what made the game what it was." "You mean Moberly's death?" "I mean the structure behind Ithaframe we never quite saw. We moved from piece to piece, room to room, memory to memory. But what if the entire affair was a demonstration? A final composition by someone who knew how we think. I frowned. Lydia. Holmes shook his head. Not Lydia. She was the last player, but not the architect. You're suggesting Aurelia designed this? No, he said, pacing slowly now. I'm suggesting that someone, perhaps even Aurelia herself, saw the board not as a battlefield, but as a language. One that could be passed down, used, bent. He stopped in front of the ledger. Every move Maberly made was a response to guilt. But every move Lydia made, it was instructional. She wanted us to see something. He opened the black ledger and flipped back several pages to the list I remembered well. The seamstress who dreamt of fire, the orchard that bloomed in December, the drowned. Man's whisper, the watchmaker's silence, the sigh that cracked the window. Holmes tapped the spine. Each of these, Watson, follows a pattern. Not a case pattern, a ritual pattern. A key left in plain sight. What sort of key? He closed the ledger. A key to memory. Each involved a forgotten act, a fractured identity, a symbol or object returning from the past, and in each, the crime was not violence, but reconstruction. Someone or something was trying to make a point through us. I was quiet for a moment. You think we were meant to see all 5 cases as part of a single message? Holmes looked to the blank wooden square on the mantel. No, I think they were preludes. And now that the board has been cleared, we're being invited to begin. A knock came at the door, unusually late. Mrs. Hudson, wrapped in a shawl, poked her head in moments later. Gentlemen, she said, a visitor. The man who entered was elderly but composed, wearing an academic's coat and a velvet cravat pinned with a carved wooden clasp. His gloves were thin and creased at the knuckle. Holmes rose. May I ask your name? The man bowed slightly. Professor Erland Vives. I believe you've become acquainted with one of my great-aunts. Holmes froze for a half-breath, then gestured to the seat beside the fire. You've come about Aurelia. Professor Vives smiled thinly. I've come about what she left behind. We sat in silence for a moment as the fire cracked gently. Then the professor reached into his coat and withdrew a small parcel, wrapped in cloth and bound with red cord. This, he said, was found hidden in the lining of a music box that once belonged to her. It came into my hands only recently, when a distant cousin passed and left me a box of discarded heirlooms. I recognized her initials, and, well, given your involvement in recent matters, I believe it now belongs with you. Holmes took the parcel and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a chess piece, not ivory, not rosewood, but black marble, a queen. Unlike the previous piece Holmes had kept on the mantel, this queen was angular, harshly cut, and cold to the touch. Her crown was unadorned. Her base bore a single etched line horizontal, as though crossing out something that had once been written there. Beneath the piece lay a folded slip of parchment. Holmes read it aloud. She was not the only queen. The board was never singular. There is another game. Find it. EVWE stared at the piece in silence. Then Holmes laughed. It was soft, dry, not unkind. She was right, he said. The game beneath the game. I spoke cautiously. What does it mean, Holmes? It means, he said, rising to place the black marble queen on the blank wooden square, that everything we thought was resolution was, in fact, an invitation to what? He looked at me. His eyes were not gleaming with excitement, nor with dread, but with something rarer respect to begin again. And with that, a new board was born. Chapter 16. The Queen Without a Crown. The black marble queen stood stark and solitary upon the blank wooden square on our mantel, her silhouette casting a sharp diagonal shadow in the morning light. Unlike the ivory queen of the first game, whom Holmes had once called a memory in motion, this figure possessed no such warmth. She was cold geometry, chiseled restraint, and silence incarnate. Neither Holmes nor I spoke much in the days that followed the visit from Professor Vives. He had returned to Oxford almost immediately, claiming his responsibilities at the Ashmolean Museum could not afford long absences. But I suspected his true reason was cautioning had delivered the piece, and in doing so, removed himself from the board entirely. Holmes, meanwhile, did not touch the marble queen. He studied her as one might study a fossil of an extinct species, something both final and instructive. And every morning I noticed that he seemed to shift just slightly, as if tuning himself to a frequency only he could hear. At last, late one evening, Holmes sat forward in his armchair and addressed me in that clipped, measured tone I had come to associate with a new theory taking shape. "Do you recall the phrase Aurelia used in her third journal? The Queen rules only the board she remembers." I furrowed my brow. "I do. You said it was metaphorical." I was wrong. It was literal. He rose and crossed to the bookshelf, drawing down a thin folio, one of Aurelia's translated journals we had acquired indirectly through Lydia Broom. Opening it, Holmes turned to a page halfway through and tapped a line. "Carve her without her crown, and she will move differently. She will no longer be the queen you expect." I read it twice, then looked at the marble piece. So this figure, this new queen, was meant to represent a different kind of power. "Not power," Holmes said. "Perspective." He turned to the fire and began to pace, speaking more to the room than to me. "In standard chess, the queen is the most powerful piece capable of reaching every corner of the board. But she must know her position, must assume her identity. Strip her of her crown, remove the emblem of commandant. Not weak, but unreadable. An impostor. A rogue element in a system that depends on clarity." I nodded slowly. "Which means no one recognizes her. Not the player, not the opponent." "Precisely," Holmes said, stopping before the hearth. "And if one such piece were to appear in the game, either deliberately or by deception, it would alter every move that followed." "A hidden queen," I murmured. Holmes turned, and his face was unreadable. "A queen without a crown. A queen no longer perceived as such. A piece in disguise, not to deceive the player, but the board itself." He returned to the table and pulled out the black ledger again, flipping past the archive of forgotten games to a newer, blank section. At the top of the page, he wrote one line: "The game of the unseen queen." He tapped the pen thoughtfully against the page, then said, "We've assumed that the game ended with Lydia Broom's final gesture. But what if she was merely fulfilling an older role, passing along the burden of recognition?" "To whom?" Holmes looked up. "To us. But there's no crime," I said. "No fresh body, no client. Only a message in marble and metaphor." Holmes' smile was faint. "Is that not what Lydia gave us before, Watson? The illusion of a case. She wrapped it in the memory of violence, but what she truly offered was insight. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. So let us take the lesson to its natural conclusion. Assume the board is still active. Assume this new queen is on it. Hidden, perhaps, or worse, forgotten. I felt a subtle dread settle over the room. If that's true, Holmes, then we don't know what she wants, or what her moves will be. Exactly, he said. Which means we must locate the pattern before the queen reveals herself. We began the search not in London, but in paper. Holmes wrote to archivists across the continent: Hungary, Austria, Bavaria, inquiring about Aurelia Viv's artistic legacy. He sought patterns in her commissions, her symbols, and her patrons. In turn, I scoured the correspondence between Lydia and the various collectors who had handled her father's estate. The late Colonel Broom had possessed not just military antiques, but rare chess manuscripts, many of which bore esoteric notes in Latin and Hungarian cipher. And then, one morning, Holmes received a small parcel from Munich. Inside was a tattered pamphlet bound in green cord. No date, no publisher, only a title, handwritten in German: Die still Dame, ein Spiel, Farner Inon, Spieler, the Silent Lady. A game for only one player. Holmes opened it slowly, and the contents chilled me. It was not a chess manual, it was a ritual. A sequence of movements to be played alone. At night, with a hand-carved set, one queen missing her crown, and one board with a single square deliberately blank. The final instruction read, "She will reveal herself when the game is no longer a game." Holmes looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is not waiting for us to play," he said. "She's waiting for us to remember." The board was no longer metaphor, it was map, memory, mirror, and someone somewhere was already making the first move. Chapter 17. The move that was never made. Day week after the arrival of the Silent Lady, Holmes announced that the final piece had arrived, not by post or by person, but by omission. "The game has ended," he said one morning as we sat with untouched tea, not with a checkmate, but with a gesture no one saw. I looked up from the newspaper. "I don't follow." He rose and went to the mantel, where the black marble queen still stood, its shadow fixed in the amber light of the hearth. The pamphlet said the queen would reveal herself when the game was no longer a game. He continued, "That is to say, when we stopped treating her as a symbol and began to see her as a player." He paused. "Tell me, Watson, who has been absent in all of this? Who, despite her presence in every room, every recollection, every consequence, has not made a single move of her own?" I frowned. "Aurelia. But she's dead." Holmes shook his head. "No, not Aurelia." He turned to the black ledger and opened it, flipping back to the case notes from the Broom investigation. Then he withdrew from it the folded slip of paper we had nearly forgotten. Lydia's final note, delivered anonymously and unsigned. "The board is yours now. Play gently." A dot. My brow furrowed. We assumed that A was Aurelia. Holmes smiled faintly. We assumed incorrectly. He drew from his coat pocket a single envelope, sealed in wax, which had arrived that morning. No name, no return addressed, just a hand-drawn black queen on the front. Inside, a simple note. She was always behind the curtain, watching the board unfold. She needed a player who could finish what she began. "You were never solving a crime, Mr. Holmes. You were inheriting a position. The Silent Queen is not a piece. She is the one who removes herself from the game to shape it. LBI sat back, stunned. Lydia. It was always Lydia. Holmes nodded. She was the final queen, not the player, nor the piece, but the true force behind the structure we've spent months unfolding. He returned to the fire, his gaze unfocused now, fixed somewhere inward. Think back. Lydia's coded invitations. Her decision to let her father's memory fracture naturally. Her refusal to identify the burned piece in the hearth. Every act was deliberate, each omission an instruction. But why the theatrics? I asked. Why not simply tell us? Because, Holmes said, truth is never absorbed through declaration. It is absorbed through movement. She wanted us to walk the board, to see what it meant, to witness, interpret, lose, and reconstruct meaning without ever quite touching the center. He tapped the blank wooden square on the mantel. That space, Watson, was never meant for a queen. It was meant for the absence of one, the unseen queen, the one whose power came from withdrawal, from restraint, from letting the others reveal themselves. He returned the black marble queen to its velvet pouch and placed it gently into the black ledger. Then, after a long silence, he said, "She taught us to listen for the sigh that cracked the window, not the storm that shattered it. Subtlety over spectacle, design over drama. That, my dear Watson, was her final move." I exhaled slowly. And the game? Holmes looked at me, eyes calm. There never was a game. He placed the blank square back on the shelf and turned away from the mantel for the last time. Later that day, we walked along the embankment. The wind off the Thames was biting, but Holmes seemed unaffected by it. His mind, I could tell, was at peace, at least, for now. "You know," I said, "this case. It was unlike any other. No murderer, no arrest. And yet I feel as though we've closed something profound." Holmes gave one of his rare, true smiles. "Not every resolution comes with iron bars or courtrooms, Watson. Some truths must be learned, not judged." He stopped, watching the river drift below the gray winter sky. "She gave us her final piece," he said softly, "and we played it." As we turned back toward Baker Street, I noticed Holmes leave something behind on a low stone ledge. Near the Riverwalk, I recognized it instantly. The bishop's fragment. He left it there without a word, letting it go, placing it like a piece no longer needed on a board that had vanished. And with that silent act, the last move was made. The board was clear, the queen unseen, the sigh forgotten, because it had already been heard. The end.